I've just admitted two people.
Why? Good evening. Welcome to the Photographic Historical Society of Canada's monthly program. My name is Celio Barreto, and I am the programming coordinator at the PHSC. And it is a pleasure to welcome you once again to our program on the third Wednesday of the month. I would like to begin by introducing you to our president, Mr. Clint Grigoriou, with a few words about the society, what we do, and how you can help.
My goodness, thank you very much for that. Wow, that's a very tugging at the heartstrings introduction, Celio. We are the PHSC, the Photographic Historical Society of Canada. Welcome. If you're new to us, we're very friendly. We don't bite. We are all about the history and research of photography. Canada, if we're lucky, and the world of photography, if we're really lucky. We have a membership, $35 a year. It's all it costs. You get a wonderful journal 3 or 4 times a year. Little discounts on stuff here and there. We meet, as we are now, once a month, the third Wednesday of every month. We would encourage you to join, become a member. At the very least, go to our website, www.phsc.ca, and sign up for our monthly email newsletter. It's a lot of fun. It's very diverse, all sorts of topics, hardware, images, everything in between. It doesn't cost anything to sign up for the monthly email newsletter. We encourage you, along with to visit that, along with the about 2,000 people that we currently have signed up for monthly email newsletters. We don't sell your email to anyone at any price. We don't rent it. We don't disseminate it. We guard it very jealously, so it sticks with us forever. Do visit us at phsc.ca. Keeps you up to speed on all sorts of events like this. And folks, I got to tell you, stay tuned, because now that restrictions are easing left, right, and center, we'll be coming back with our fairs and our auctions and all sorts of good stuff like that. I think it's going to be a busy spring, early summer. Let the chips fall where they may, and it'll be good to see everybody in person. This is, like I say, this program meeting is one of the many things that we do. Do check us out online. We have very active Instagram account, Facebook as well. If you've already looked through all the listings on phsc.ca, well, go to Facebook, go to Instagram. Actually, go there first. It's a little shorter to see everything on there. Celio, if this is one of the many things we're involved in, if just before we start, you maybe want to talk very briefly about maybe something you may be involved with, just as a little commercial for yourself, and maybe you should also just add a second paragraph to that, what we're planning for March, or rather not planning for March and actually planning for April, to keep people up to speed, because they're going to show up in the month and go,
Right.
where is everyone?
I know. Well, thank you, Clint. So yeah, I'm gonna my horn a little bit here. Tomorrow, after this meeting, I will be finishing writing up my presentation. I've been invited to deliver a paper at Heidelberg Photo 2022, and I am excited. I have to teach a class at 8 o'clock, finishing at 10:45, and then I present at 11 o'clock, and the panel ends at 1:15, and I start teaching my second class of the day at 1:25 until 4:10. So it's going to be a very relaxing day. I'm super thrilled. I'm excited. I get to chat about a new twist in my research, a new direction that I'm taking with digital media and old Japanese photography. So I'm very excited, and hopefully, at some point in the future, after the presentation, I can share this stuff with you at some point. Now, for March, we have something called March break. But at the PHSC, we had no idea that this holiday existed until this year. We are taking March off last summer, following our traditional July and August, time off for the summer. Last year we did not do that. We kept going through July and August, and it's catching up to me. And so, yeah, sorry guys, next month you get to take a break. I know, I can hear the hearts breaking. I hear the pop everywhere, but it's all good because April 29th, Friday, we are actually hosting a symposium on three color photography led by Dr. Haneen Hanoush. In oh, I forget now the but it is is hosted by us, and it is yeah, with the European Society for the History of Photography, right? The photo researcher. So this is a collaboration that we're doing between the three of us. We're going to have about 10 different speakers, two panels, and it's going to be an afternoon full of all things color photography. It is going to be fantastic. And it's a special program. This is the first collaboration. It's a transatlantic collaboration. It's going to take place at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. No, 6 p.m. European time. The ESHPH is based in Vienna, and Dr. Hanush is based in Berlin, and of course, we're based here in Toronto. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have Canadian moderators and contributors to the symposium as well, so this is going to be a very, very exciting program. So, in order to prepare for it, in order for it to go well, I will need to suspend programming for March so that, in April we get, you know, blown away. All right. Putting that aside, I would like to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Someone really special, Dr. Christine Slobogan, who is an art historian working within the medical humanities. The Wellcome Trust, the Paul Mellon Center for the Study of British Art, and the Northern Network for Medical Humanities Research at Durham University have all funded her postdoctoral research. Dr. Slobogan is a visiting early career research fellow at the John Rylands Research Institute at the University of Manchester, researching the history of medical anonymity, primarily in photographs. Her research on historical empathy and plastic surgery photographs and drawings has been published in Medical Humanities, and she has a chapter forthcoming in an edited volume published by Bloomsbury on British humor during the Second World War. She is also co-convener of the Paul Mellon Center's Early Career Researchers Network, and she is the newsletter editor for the College Art Association affiliated society, Historians of British Art. Without any further ado, Dr. Slobogan.
Thank you so much for that, Celio. Let me go ahead and share my screen first. And I assume you guys will just let me know if you can't hear me or see me.
So far, amazing.
So far, so good? Excellent. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much to Celio for inviting me to speak to you all. I'm really honored to be in this virtual space with the PHSC, even if it is when I am in London. So I'll be speaking to you for about 45 minutes, and then we will have ample time for question and answer and discussion afterwards. But before I go ahead and start my talk, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about myself and how I do my research. So as Celio said, I'm trained as an art historian, but I specialize in the field of medical humanities. So I look at images that deal with the body, surgery, medicine, and health. Of course, these types of images intersect with other ideas and concepts, or other fields and concepts like nationalism, as I'll talk about tonight. And so this interdisciplinary work, this work that I do in multiple fields, means that I often will use medical frameworks to think about art history, and I will also use art historical frameworks to think about histories of medicine. So this also means that the work that I'm presenting tonight on photography will include images of surgery. And I do want to give you a warning, a heads up, that some audience members may find these images or the descriptions of surgery that I will give to be a bit disturbing. And on that note, I would like to say that, I'm very happy for anyone to take screenshots of my presentation, of my slides, share them with friends or share them on social media, or whatever you want to do. Just please refrain from taking any images of any of the patients that I'm showing. As you can imagine, there are some fraught ethics with sharing patient images on social media. So just do try to be aware of that as I'm giving my talk, and as you might be tempted to take images off of it. And then finally, one last thing of housekeeping before I actually start my talk. I do want to say that because this is how academic presentations usually happen in the UK, I will be reading my presentation instead of ad-libbing it. This paper is adapted from a journal article that's currently in production. But hopefully I've made it a little bit more conversational and slightly less jargony, than those journal articles typically are. But if you have any further questions that you'd like me to address beyond the Q&A, I have put my Twitter and my email address here, and I would be very happy to continue the conversation after tonight, if you're interested. Okay, I think that's all of the housekeeping that I need to get out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my talk. So this research is a story about a photographer of plastic surgery, specifically about how his work lets us see into the unexpected ways that narratives of British nationalism, some might say propaganda, were put forth by imagery, particularly photography, during and after the Second World War. Between October 1941 and January 1942, the British surgical photographer Percy Hennell, who you can see on the left here, accompanied the plastic surgeon Harold Delph Gillies on a lecture tour of the Americas. Their stops were wide-ranging. In October, they were in Chicago and Houston. In November, in Lima, Santiago, Montevideo, Buenos Aires, Rosario, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo. And in December, they lectured in Toronto and Montreal, Washington, and New York City. On this tour, Gillies, who was called in several American newspaper articles the bald, benevolent, world-famous father of modern plastic surgery, he lectured on the unique advances of British surgery. And Hennell showcased his pioneering British color photography that documented these surgical advances. Newspapers highlighted the role of color photographs as well as a color film in Gillies's presentations. In addition to showing Hennell's color photographs, these lectures displayed a Technicolor movie of victims of war, proudly exhibiting their new faces, arms, and bodies that had been reconstructed through plastic surgery. And this film that was shown during the lecture tour was presumably one called Plastic Surgery in Wartime, which I've had the privilege of watching on a VHS tape here in a medical archive here in London. And this film, Plastic Surgery in Wartime, was a government-sponsored piece of propaganda narrated by Gillies and produced earlier in 1941. And so the government also sponsored at least part of Gillies's tour. According to Gillies's biographer, the British Council, who funded a lot of propaganda during the Second World War, had committed him to a tough itinerary, during which Gillies had flown 27,000 miles, given 36 lectures, and made an uncounted number of speeches, and performed 16 operations. So Hennell, the photographer's accompaniment of the eminent Gillies across the Americas, evidences that images were a major component of the trip's directive. Gillies' biographer highlights that even on the surgeon's earlier lecture tour after the First World War, Gillies traveled with 700 lantern slides as part of his luggage. By 1941, by the start of this lecture tour, Gillies had been a proponent of clinical photography in Britain for several decades, earning him the position of chairman of the Royal Photographic Society's medical group. And Gillies and Hennell had been collaborating since 1940, when Hennell began taking photographs in plastic surgery wards, including at the plastic surgery ward in England, where Gillies was the head surgeon. So lecture tours by British plastic surgeries. Oops, sorry, this sounds like someone's not muted. But anyway, lecture tours by British plastic surgery's illustrious figures like Gillies were meant to advertise to other countries, both visually and orally, the standout nature of these individual surgeons, but also the standout nature of British plastic and reconstructive surgery as a whole. So in addition to the 1941 to 42 tour that he did with Hennell, Gillies did a lecture tour during the First World War, and he made a later trip to Boston, both of which cemented at the beginning of the 20th century his status as a person of importance on the international surgical scene. And in 1948, similarly, Archibald McIndoe, a plastic surgeon who came to prominence in Britain during the Second World War, he also carried out a lecture tour in America and Canada that was extensively covered in the press. So this was a common practice going on these lecture tours, but they seem to have been more important and present, particularly in the 1940s. So why is that? Historians of plastic surgery have noted the ways in which plastic surgeons in the first half of the 20th century worked really hard to cultivate a particular image of themselves and their work that would raise the public and professional estimation of their field. So to avoid being perceived as all about the surface and all about cosmetic appearance, and therefore being perceived as not real or necessary medical practitioners, plastic surgeons emphasized not the aesthetic nature of their work, but the reconstructive nature of their work and its physical and emotional / mental health benefits. But this plastic surgery proselytizing that we see in these lecture tours of the 1940s was beneficial for Britain on an international scale as well. And these tours fit into the parameters of British propaganda abroad during the war years. British propaganda in the United States in particular worked at the intersection of foreign relations and American culture. And this type of cultural propaganda was present in art exhibitions, in films, and in many events and outputs that promoted and disseminated British national aims, apart from and in addition to the specific economic or political messages that we usually associate with war propaganda. So the explicit purpose of Gillies and Hennell's presentations during their 1941 to 42 lecture tour was to tout British achievement in surgery and in clinical photography. But it also had the additional purpose of bolstering the status of Britain at war at a time when initially America was still teetering between neutrality and entering the conflict. So that historical point, that pinpoint is really important. Oops, sorry. So in addition to this history of British propaganda in the Americas, this research that I've been working on is also drawing on the history of nationalism in science and medicine in general, where surgical or medical progress is linked to national pride. And photography has a really important role in this history, in this linkage. So on this slide here, I have two examples of this type of scientific progress as it relates to French national identity, which is a national identity and a scientific identity that parallels the British situation. So, for example, the first facial transplant recipient, Isabelle Dinoir, had her surgery take place in France in 2005 in a climate of nationalistic pride. There was what some have called a face race to be the surgical team that gave their country the accolade of being the first to successfully complete a face transplant. This was also the case with the first heart transplant in 1967 in South Africa, and with many other medical firsts. And this history in France built upon a longer history in that country with scientific and medical advances providing France with wider political strength and power during the 19th century. So a medical scientist like Louis Pasteur, seen on the stamp here, was considered a national symbol in his home country. And so surgeons like Harold Gillies, even though he was originally from New Zealand, likewise earned this moniker of being a national symbol for Britain in the mid-20th century. The American press coverage proving his international fame and respect and highlighting the importance of Britain's and Gillies's linked successes. So British plastic surgery, as framed by British plastic surgeons, was the indisputably world-leading center of the field. The 1987 history of the British Association of Plastic Surgery states that, quote, the history of the association is linked so intimately with that of the specialty that it would be impossible to separate the two, and that this history with a distinctive British shape has had worldwide influence. So, like scientific advancements represented by Gillies's hands here on the right, photography, represented by Hennel on the left, was an important tool for conveying British narratives of global influence from the 19th century onwards. So once again here, I'm tying this in with a longer history of nationalism in science. In the 19th century in Britain, photography helped to visualize the cultural and scientific superiority of British, particularly English society, with many Victorians arguing that the combination of scientific and photographic achievements demonstrated the superiority of British civilization. This, of course, only helped to fuel arguments for the oppressive actions of the British Empire. But while the empire was in its decline in the mid-20th century, when Hennel and Gillies did their lecture tour, their plastic surgery photography is still tied up in this colonialist visual history of scientific exceptionalism. So the photographs that Hennel and Gillies showed in their lectures depicted patients at several key moments. When they arrived at the hospital, in between their steps of the surgeries, when they were healing, and when they were healing after surgery or between operations. And often these patients would endure years or months or years of surgeries, sometimes getting into, I think the highest number I've seen was, 32 on one patient. So lots of documentation. But oftentimes in presentations, the middle images were removed and in the presentations, and just the before and after pairs were shown. So you would just have the one at the far left and the far right. So like the words spoken by Gillies on this lecture tour, these images put forward a particular message about the power of British surgeons in surgery. And as will be explored throughout this talk tonight, the aesthetic and compositional tools of Hennel's color surgical photographs also proved useful for writers and publishers outside of the medical realm who wanted to advertise similarly propagandistic, nationalistic narratives. But we'll have to get to these two books shortly. And first, before I get to those, I want to back up a bit and answer something that many of you are likely thinking, which is, who was Percy Hennel? And how did he become a photographer who could communicate these large ideas of British pride and progress, both within surgery and within wider contexts? What was his background before he set out with Gillies to the Americas? So Hennel was born in October 1911 to a family of silversmiths, gold beaters, and jewelers. So quite an artistic or cultural family from the get-go. His initial artistic interest was actually outside of photography, and he trained as a sculptor at St. Martin's School of Art in London, taking up photography afterwards. During the 1930s, he was employed in a photographic studio on Great Portland Street in London, likely helping to make portrait photographs. And in 1938, he got a job as a manager for the color photographic department of the Metal Box Company, where he practiced advertising and documentary photography, which I think is a really important parallel. That field of advertising and documentary photography is a really important parallel to the photographs with propagandistic messages that we are looking at tonight. So in this capacity at the metal box company that he took up at the end of the 1930s, he would have been overseeing the photographing of the metal box company's products, namely, as you might imagine, metal boxes and storage containers. During the war, however, the metal box company shifted from producing canning products to making wartime goods that were used by every service in every theater of war, or so the company's advertisements at this time said. So in this spirit, at the beginning of the war, the chairman of the metal box company told Henel that he should, quote, do something useful in the national sense with his color photography. And Henel was then employed by the Medical Research Council of the British government to take photographs in surgical wards, particularly reconstructive plastic surgery, which is a field that really exploded during the First World War and had lots of advances during the First World War, largely thanks to Gillies. And I think it was expected that the field would continue to grow and advance during the Second World War. And that is part of the reason that Henel was particularly assigned to these plastic surgery wards. So overall, this talk is going to use the Americas lecture tour that I've just outlined, with Gillies as the starting point for thinking about how Henel's three major photographic projects of the 1940s, his plastic surgery photography, his illustrations for J.B. Priestley's propagandistic British Women Go to War from 1943, and his images for Geoffrey Grigson and John Piper's nostalgic An English Farmhouse and Its Neighborhood from 1948. So we're going to be thinking about those three groups together. And by grouping these three seemingly disparate projects together, the nationalist purpose of Henel's surgical imagery and the way that color played into this purpose becomes clearer. And we can see how Henel's work and surgical photography in general can reveal some of Britain's mid-century anxieties and points of national pride. So Henel's color is a key component of the nationalisms espoused by these photographs. In his own writing, Henel constantly emphasizes that he takes natural color photographs. In An English Farmhouse, which the image on the right comes from, the author Geoffrey Grigson writes that he and his photographer collaborator Henel, quote, believe that color photography can be revealing without being chromatically hideous. And this may have been a veiled allusion to Technicolor. And Wizard of Oz is one of the most classic examples of an early Technicolor film. And Technicolor was seen by much of the mid-century British population to be garish and too saturated and therefore distinctly American. A 1951 British publication called Color Cinematography states that a study of the British public's attitude towards color in film revealed that, quote, there does seem to be a marked antipathy to excessive use of vivid color, apparently popular in Hollywood, which may be due to a national liking for the restrained and rather sad tones typical of the British sentiment for color during the last 100 years. And film historian Sarah Street suggests that nationalist ideas and stereotypes against Americans may have led to Technicolor being perceived by British people as brasher than it actually was. So playing on long established ideas of national difference, British color was perceived as more tasteful. So Grigson and Henel had the common goal of making photography that was subtler and more appealing, and therefore perhaps more distinctly British. So it's interesting then that the Technicolor film Plastic Surgery in Wartime was likely shown on Gillies' lecture tour. It's likely that the British Council who funded the propagandistic tour recognized the national and emotional qualities of color in film and used Technicolor in this instance to appeal more to American audiences. British propagandists looking to target American audiences at this time were careful in studying American opinion and choosing their methods of dissemination widely based on that study. They studied American beliefs and attitudes in order to identify themselves with the same values or to take care not to tread on them. So it seems that the audience for the Technicolor plastic surgery in wartime was largely American, and therefore the type of color could have been used, or therefore this type of color, so Technicolor, could have been used to remain familiar and engaging for American audiences, while Hennell's more British color was used both in Britain and on the lecture tour. And I also want to note that even Hennell's technique of color photography was used by plastic surgeons as a narrative and myth building device. So Hennell used a one-shot color camera that in the surgical literature, so the history written by plastic surgeons, in the surgical literature, this type of camera is emphasized as being invented by Hennell for plastic surgery photography. And it's also stated that Hennell's type of color photography was the only type of color photography that was available from 1938 to 1944. And this is something that Hennell never claimed himself, and which is demonstrably false. You know, there were a lot of other types of color photography at this time. So even surgical color in Hennell's photographs was used to propagandize the myth of exceptionalism in British surgery and through the myth of the exceptionalism of British surgical imagery. So Hennell's 49 color photographs in J.B. Priestley's British Women Go to War had a specific invigorating message to advertise: that women in Britain, more so than in any other nation, were doing their patriotic duty by working, and that they were fulfilling these duties on the home front and abroad with alacrity and panache. Priestley states in his first sentence of the book that, quote, "No country engaged in this war has mobilized its women for the war effort more thoroughly and efficiently than Britain has." The morale boosting purpose of this book is visually furthered by Hennell's patriotic inclusion of brilliant reds and blues in hospital blankets, skies, and in colorful steel bars in factories. It's also important to note that British Women Go to War was published by the Collins Publishing House, but that it was designed and produced by Adprint Limited London, which was a company that specialized in publishing commercial and advertising rather than political or journalistic color photography. So that kind of gives you a sense of in which direction this publication was leaning. It was much more on the commercial and advertising side, which makes it feel much more propagandistic rather than journalistic. So Hennell shot these images for Priestley around the same time that he was working in plastic surgery wards. In this medical capacity, he created many before and after photographs, often as part of a longer narrative series that succinctly showed the reparative steps of British plastic surgeons' medical miracles. In a 1945 address to the Royal Photographic Society, Hennell stated that from a medical point of view, it was important to see not just a series of photographs, but to see two of them side by side. In the hospital, Hennell primarily took close-up bust portraits of people wounded in the face, which you can see at the bottom left here, but injuries on limbs and torsos also populate his surgical collection. So these images guide the viewer through the surgical story of each patient, from the initial burn or wound to the hopefully healed visage or body part months and many operations later. Hennell's photographs from the surgical ward and those in Priestley's book crafted visual narratives to communicate or advertise similar messages of British resilience. The before and after pair used historically in plastic surgery proved a particularly canny technique for conveying this message or these messages. And so the plastic surgery history, the visual plastic surgery history that I'm talking about here, is best encapsulated in Henry Tonks's before and after pastel drawings from the First World War, an example of which you can see at the bottom right of the slide. So the narrative maintained by Hennell's surgical photography suggests, like many of Tonks's drawings, that there is a clear and relatively easy path from injury to healing for these patients. The belabored time in between each step of the operation or of each operation itself or of posing the patient is elided in the singular moments that the camera can capture. Photography theorists argue that the special power of this photographic trope, of the before and after trope, comes from how the photographs relate both to one another and, most intriguingly, to a third, generally unseen event, the imagined yet invisible process of transformation. Today, we might see before and after images like these in posters advertising weight loss or hair regrowth surgeries or treatments. So it's definitely a photographic trope or an image trope that is still alive and well today. And so both in medicine and in morale, in surgery and in British Women Go to War, Hennell's photography acts as proof of the transformative nature of British industriousness and progress. In plate 7 and plate 8 of British Women Go to War depict the same woman before the war and now. In the before image, the woman was a housemaid at a doctor's in a small country town in Somerset. At the right, she has become a member of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, or the ATS, the British Army's women's branch. The woman looks down in her staged, made photograph, apparently focused on the task below her to her right, but out of our view. The action of the woman at war, however, is full of upward momentum, her tools of the trade readily appraisable by the viewer. At the left, the satiny formal maid's attire puckers and shines at each curve of her body, highlighting the outfit's impracticality and superficiality, especially when compared to the matte, rough cadet green of the ATS uniform. The frilly femininity of the maid's cap has been swapped for a hard helmet. As in these women at war images, and as has been discussed by other art historians in relation to Tonks's before and after portraits, the sartorial status of the figure is also important to the narrative being conveyed. I've put here 2 cropped images of Hennell's surgical photographs to show how the clothing of these patients can change from the before image at the top to the after image at the bottom. Many patients that Hennell photographed arrived to London hospitals in their pajamas. The collar of one set of said pajamas with the vertical orangish stripes and the brown cardigan thrown over top of it can be seen here at the top of the slide. This detail of the clothing makes us think that the pictured patient has been woken up by aerial bombardment and taken directly to the hospital. Yet in their photographs after their surgeries, the men often sport suits and ties. And these 2 surgical photographs here show the same man nearly 2 years apart. The pajama photos show these injured individuals in more vulnerable states, while suits and ties align them with traditional masculine roles, suggesting that they can easily reintegrate into productive consumer society. We can see that a similar trope was used in Tonks's First World War images at the right, where the after image of the patient includes tidied up hair, a collared shirt, and a tie. In his text accompanying plate 7 and plate 8, Priestley reflects on how this young woman, like some of her peers, may want to get back to pre-war life after the conflict is over. But this may be impossible, as Priestley says, because these years in uniform will have changed her. So once again, we're talking about how, the emphasis on the uniform and on the clothing is really clear throughout a lot of these images. And this type of double page spread is used several other times throughout British Women Go to War. In the discussion of Mrs. C, the trope is deployed to exhibit that though they have adapted and changed dramatically, these women workers have not lost their connection to their familial duties. So the war hasn't changed everything. Like the plastic surgery photographs that Hennell showed on Gillies' lecture tour, these images show a problem and its solution. Priestley describes these 2 plates in this manner, these plates of Mrs. C in this manner, stating that these photographs, quote, present the problem on a heroic scale and seem to show how it has been solved on an equally heroic scale. During the day, in a before image dominated by grays and blacks, Mrs. C works for the railway, soldering and reglassing engine lamps. But the after photograph alleviates the potential worry that Mrs. C has relinquished her womanhood for this dirty job formerly held by a man before the war. At the end of the day, Mrs. C returns to her family of 7 children, the youngest not pictured, in a cream-colored family room decorated by painted amphoras and black and white photographs. Hennel frames Mrs. C as a matriarch with her smartly dressed children, a young redheaded girl in pink, 3 of the older boys in suits and 1 in a military uniform, fanning around her in a supportive and attentive bubble as she points with a strangely prominent tattooed forearm towards a newspaper. Echoing the caption visible on the newspaper, Priestley references the Stalingrad spirit of the heroic British working class mother, which you can see in the caption there. So as with Hennel's plastic surgery patients, Mrs. C's time-consuming act of transformation is not shown. Through the before and after trope, the viewer is comforted that the indomitable wartime spirit of British women has the power to convert them from worker to housewife and from maid to military woman based on the country's needs. Similar visual tropes of female transformation can be seen in some of Hennel's surgical pairs. As the suits and ties of reconstructed men align them post-surgery to traditional masculine roles, sartorial details like pearls and lipstick can suggest a fashionable and modern femininity. Here, the blue jumper, red lipstick, and pale skin in one of Hennel's surgical pairs once again puts forth the patriotic blue, red, and white that Hennel used throughout British Women Go to War. And these 2 images show a much less graphic injury than many of those that Hennel depicted in the wards and theaters. But the visual change and the appeal to a regenerating and healing Britain is still succinct, clear, flattering, and impressive to the viewer, just like the changes magicked in the British Women Go to War pairs. So in the second image, you can see that the patient's reconstructed forehead no longer catches shadows, the dark circles under her eyes have lessened, and her hair is more neatly curled and arranged. And as with several of the British Women Go to War images, the color and the before and after conventions convey a forceful narrative about female potential and wartime transformation made possible by specifically British innovation. However, Priestley's final section in British Women Go to War, called Glance at Tomorrow, challenges the status of these after images. Priestley, the author, asks, what will be the effect of all this activity and all these changes on post-war Britain? Millions of women are doing jobs they never thought of doing before the war. What then will happen after the war? It was worth posing the question of what will happen in the war, because even though these photographs make the change look certain and permanent, the future of women in work in Britain was still unknown. The seeming ease of Hennel's pairs belies the transience of wartime change and anxieties about the longer-term impacts of these changes on British society. It would have been impossible for Priestley and Hennel to know that it was generally the case that women's working lives largely went back to pre-war patterns after the armistice. Some women moved away from working after the war because of the pervading culture and politics of post-war women's work. But historians have also shown that many women workers themselves were simply passive and disinterested about their wartime jobs. And this is certainly not the message or the surface message of Hennel's photographs, which show enthusiastic and mobile young women transformed. While overall Hennel's images here feel optimistic with their carefully chosen colors and commercially minded staging, there's a temporal complication within the publication that muddles the seemingly simple narrative of the before and after trope. Hennel's advertisements of British female adaptability, paired with Priestley's writing, unwittingly invite pondering upon the many potential future timelines of these photographic subjects. Likewise, Hennel's before and after work from Britain's plastic surgery wards both reinforce and contradict a seemingly straightforward account intended to show British exceptionalism and innovation. The surgical photographs are meant to exhibit the miraculous and almost unbelievably talented hand of the surgeon. But taking facially injured patients as subjects complicates this neat narrative. Because of the colored prominence of scars and red or pink healing patches of skin, the story of outright British medical might is complicated in the mind of the viewer. The varied hues in Hennel's photographs and examples beyond these, but you can see the scars in that top image of the anonymized patient. These colors show the inconsistent aesthetics of the healing process. Oftentimes, even the after images can be quite distressing. These images, particularly the final healed photographs of the patients, were supposed to show British surgeons' finished products. And I use that word products very deliberately, again, drawing connections between Henel's advertising roots and his surgical work. But before and after images are often necessarily reductive. Because of the complicated and traumatic vicissitudes of injury and healing, there's often no single before or conclusive after. The uncompromising detail of Henel's color photographs show scars and they show difficult aesthetics, demonstrating that often these plastic surgery patients, even though healed, will be perceivably, even if subtly, different from their peers. So Priestley, in his writing, throws doubt onto the staying power of the after images by Henel, and Henel's color in his own photographs do this in the surgical realm. These entangled visual narratives represent insidious anxieties regarding wartime change in Britain. What kind of society would exist after the war? What kind of scars would the conflict leave, both literal and metaphorical, on British people individually and as a whole? These complications allow the viewer to go beyond the positivist wartime message of the simple past and simple after. Surgeons would have wanted to convey the tidy simplicity present in Henel's image constructions, particularly in propagandistic international lectures. They commissioned color photography, perhaps mistakenly, to advertise this message. Looking at Henel's non-surgical photographs in tandem with his medical imagery helps us to understand the complex story of national progress and healing that he and his collaborators were trying to convey. So it was Henel's experience of color photography as a nationalistic and documentary tool for the Metal Box Company and plastic surgery wards and for British Women Go to War that made him an ideal photographer for An English Farmhouse in Its Neighborhood from 1948, edited by John Piper and written by Geoffrey Grigson. Henel's close crops and colorful attention to detail in this publication, again, subtly encapsulate wartime and post-war concerns in Britain, this time around rebuilding and the disastrous effects of decay or destruction of war or modernity. Messages also implicit in Henel's surgical and overtly propagandistic works. An English Farmhouse contains 30 color photographs by Henel, taking an elegiac approach to cultural nationalism. Here, there's a focus on vernacular architecture in the English countryside, with a lamentation of disused or abandoned rural buildings being replaced by those that are not natives of native conception and native material. So vernacular architecture basically means using the material that is available in the area in which you're building. So this book emphasizes the importance of history and tradition. To strengthen the perceived distinction of the old farmhouse and English farmsteads, Grigson traces the modest history of a farm, meant to stand in for all similar locales back to 6th century Saxon predecessors. And Grigson's book fits into a broader group of publications that cemented the study of country landscape history in academic circles, while also encouraging the public's attention to and interest in the countryside. So both author Geoffrey Grigson and editor John Piper were associated with the group, the Neo-Romantics at the time. And Neo-Romanticism was an artistic movement in mid-20th century Britain that largely consisted of landscape artists. So Henel's photographs communicated a message agreed upon by the three of them, Grigson, Piper, and Henel, in this collaborative project. And Neo-Romanticism had a large role to play in this message. Part of the Neo-Romantic agenda of the 1940s, captured photographically in An English Farmhouse, was a symbolic conservation of Britain. The editor John Piper's own artwork, which you can see here, was very much in this nostalgic and nationalist vein, with his representations of country houses and churches being spurred on by the threat of the obliteration of the past from Nazi bombing. You can see in this slide here some of Piper's most famous work, which showed the ruins of towns in Britain that had been obliterated by the Blitz, the same aerial bombardment that injured many of the patients that Henel photographed in surgical wards. So Hennell's project with Grigson and Piper was, like his surgical work, involved in the profuse documentation of a domestic entity that required reconstruction. In this case, it was national heritage and culture rather than British faces and limbs, as in the surgical wards. In the preface of one of his other books about the Romantic artist Samuel Palmer, Geoffrey Grigson ends with a plea, quote, that more care should be taken to preserve all the various documents which show how and why English artists lived and painted. A terrible destruction must have gone on in the last 100 years. An English farmhouse serves this documentary role alongside other national projects and schemes in the post-war years to preserve British cultural history. Documentation, history, and attention to the national flavor of their disciplines were important to both neo-romantics and to 20th and 21st century plastic surgeons, seemingly completely disparate groups. And remember from the beginning of this talk when I mentioned that these plastic surgeons emphasized the undeniably British flavor of plastic surgery as a whole. So retired plastic surgeon Brian Morgan ended his 2016 history of the archive of the British Association of Plastic, Reconstructive, and Aesthetic Surgeons with, similarly to Grigson, a plea to association members to think of the instrument you invented or the photograph at the bottom drawer of your desk and let the archive know. This was necessary because, quote, obituaries are rarely written and published now, so people who have contributed to the development of our specialty will be forgotten. Hennell's photography served the role of record keeping for these seemingly very different groups then and now, preserving British histories against destruction and decay. And these quotations and Hennell's photos show the anxieties around these British histories being forgotten. Hennell's color photographs in an English farmhouse developed this conservationist agenda by capturing the specifics of the farmhouse to make the dilapidated environs feel as if they're still softly pulsing with life, bringing vitality to ruins like those that we see in Piper's paintings. The lens of the camera became the tool for Grigson, Piper, and then the wider audience of this book to view and diagnose the structural or even bodily ailments of the English farmhouse and countryside. One image is provocatively titled The Dying Barn, but it is not quite dead yet. So this book dissects each element of the countryside neighborhood's body as if it is not quite yet a corpse, but that it soon would be without our careful attention. As Grigson states in the preface, the point of the publication is to discover how such buildings were made and to see the parts that make up the whole anatomy of the farmhouse and its neighborhood. Quote, one must bring one's eye to the unfamiliar view until one sees the grain and the shape as well as the total. So in this book, An English Farmhouse, Hennell reprises his role as medical photographer to document in colored detail each fragment of the farm, while Grigson writes the nostalgically poetic diagnosis of the reasons for the English farm's decline. Instead of focusing in on a burnt face or a fractured arm or a tin or a label of a canned product, here Hennell homed in on bricks, thatch, and wood beams. This was exactly the type of profuse documentation that was practiced in 20th century British surgery wards, where, according to surgeons themselves, documentation had reached a fine art with photographers like Hennell. Grigson remarks on the importance of this closely cropped element of the book's illustrations. Quote, we include no wide view of the farm. There have been color plates enough of typical farmsteads, but bringing the camera close up to a coin, to a piece of paving, to an elm fence, to a patch of lichen, that may reveal what the normal use of cameras does not incline one, certainly does not train one to notice. So plate 20 at the right here depicts the framework of a decayed barn, still firm despite its lack of roof. This photograph is meant to display the strength of native materials and historic craftsmanship, but also to preserve with an image something that may not exist in a few years. The lush greens of the farm can be seen behind the skeletal remnants of this one relatively tiny corner of the farmstead. But the photograph's tight crop highlights the importance of the minute. Hennell's color photography grasps at the deeply creviced beams, pockmarked with knots and holes. His work documents the most seemingly insignificant details of the English farmstead, such as yellowed lichen and initials carved into wood. And this is a type of nostalgic propaganda. Pairing with Grigson's text and Piper's vision, Hennell's photographs show Britons and others the heritage, history, and strength of England's countryside. As was the case with Gillies' lecture tour, not only was the purpose of this publication to show something uniquely British, but it was also to, quote, produce outstanding examples of what the color camera can do. The color that Hennell used was lauded by the surgeons and authors with whom he worked. This was the particularly British color that helped to propagandize the nation's medical might in the Americas, and it was the color that avoided being chromatically hideous, according to Grigson, allowing for a message about Britain's history and heritage to be preserved in a particularly British manner for British audiences. Viewing these surgical and nostalgic images alongside the more overtly nationalist photographs from British Women Go to War reveals the aesthetic threads and shared purposes throughout Hennell's work from the 1940s. So I'll wrap it up now. Photographic historian Val Williams states that during the 1940s, quote, color photography with its vividness and immediacy emerged from the spheres of business, commerce, and advertising to become a vital tool in the boosting of British morale and exhibiting a particular vision of Britishness. Hennell's commercially minded color photography projects not only, or his commercially minded color photography projects not only boosted British morale, but also communicated and advertised nationalist messages. Hennell's projects with Priestley and with Grigson and Piper are not as far removed from what he was doing within the wartime plastics surgery wards as it may first appear. Hennell's surgical images proselytized a soft propaganda of Britain's and British surgeons' medical achievements. In British Women Go to War, he propagandized the national spirit and strength of Britain's women. And in an English farmhouse, this noble perseverance and the nostalgic need for preservation and documentation was applied to the country's farmsteads. In British Women Go to War and in his surgical images, Hennell used the before and after trope to demonstrate progress and change in the modern era. In an English farmhouse and his surgical photographs, he used tight shots of crumbling entities to document and preserve physical details of British history. In these projects, Hennell's photographs hint at the anxieties about the impacts of the war and modernization. Hennell was employed as a documentary photographer, one who could and should show what is there in front of him. And yet these photographs are also advertisements created by a trained commercial artist. Through analyzing these two book projects, we can more fully understand the political and advertorial purposes of Hennell's photography in the realm of Second World War plastic surgery. And this throws a sharp light onto the nationalistic goals of surgical photography, making it clear why Hennell's imagery was perfect for a propagandistic tour of the Americas. Thank you very much.
Wow, fantastic.
Thank you, Celia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slovagan. All right, well, we are going to take a quick 5-minute break. So you may refill your coffee mugs or your vodka shot glasses. And yeah, I know. And we will be back at 9:05 for our Q&A. All right.
That was
See you
brilliant.
guys in a little bit.
That was brilliant.
Right?
Wow. Boy, oh
My
boy.
goodness.
I was worried when Christine said that I would be reading, you know, because we're more ad-libbers, right? But it just flows.
It just flows.
So,
Right? So naturally.
beautifully.
Right. It's almost as though she really put her mind to this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's very
The
kind.
noodle.
No, that was I just this very you have this very calming way of presenting. It's
That's good. Thank you.
just loaded with information. You know, it never ceases to blow my little tiny mind when somebody points out something to me that I've looked at a million times, to this and that, to this and that, to this and that. and then explains in greater detail than I've ever been able to fathom not only how it was done, but why it was done.
Yeah, I mean, we see before and after images everywhere.
Yep. Yep.
And there's a really brilliant book edited by, it's called Before and After Photography.
There's
a lot of different chapters about different ways that it's used. So in like climate change photography, and, medical images, specifically on hysteria. And it's a really brilliant book because it just really dives deep into, like you said, all the complexities of this seemingly really simple trope. And that's where I got a lot of my, I mean, I cite it in all of my more official work.
Indeed, yes.
It's really brilliant.
One of your predecessors, one of our other speakers, Andrzej, very complicated Polish last name, forgive me, Andrzej. He did you would think a simple, it's called, I think, After Notman. So he took old photographs by Notman in and around Montreal, Kingston, Toronto, whatever. And he set about a goal to re-photograph them in the modern era from the same angle and with the same lens, a similar lens, and not only at the same time of day, but at the same time of year, before, and then 162 years
That's
later and after. Fascinating stuff.
That would have been a great case study for the book I was just talking about. That was brilliant. Yeah.
Real challenging stuff, because he was able to determine that in some cases, the sun cast a shadow from that building only 1 or 2 days a year. And if you didn't have sunshine that day, well, y'all come back, folks, another 12 months from now.
Yeah.
Brilliant job. And some of the material you have to reject because it rained that day, for instance. Tough. And that, you would think, oh, simple concept before, after. You just show up, oh, the building's still there, he'll take a picture. No.
Yeah.
Really, the photographer a number of years ago either was standing on a wagon or a barrel or climbed to the roof of a building. That's no longer there.
Right.
So
yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Wow. Yeah.
Well, I would have loved to go to that talk. That sounds great.
Actually, if you go, I'll see if I can find it for you on our website.
Celia was saying you've got some things on YouTube and some things in your archive.
I think Mr. Carter, our webmaster, will, he's probably listening right now going, Clint, I know exactly what you mean. Boom.
I'll have a little poke around as well.
We'll poke around. We'll find it for you. We'll send it along too. That was our brush about 10 years ago with before and after.
Yeah.
But I tell you,
I know it's fantastic. I for some reason I didn't think plastic surgery went that far back. I just thought it was something from the 70s, right? That you would see on Dallas or Dynasty or something.
Well, I can go into the history of plastic surgery if you want me to. I don't know if you want me to do that, but always happy to talk more about.
Well, now that you mention it, what about the silver noses that people used back in the day?
Yeah, so actually, should we just say that this is the start of the Q&A? Because I can go ahead.
Are you ready to go? All right.
Yeah, let's just do it.
Okay. All right. So I would like to invite everyone to either post your questions in the chat window, or if you prefer, turn on your mic and your camera and raise your hand. Use the hand icon. We'll acknowledge you, and you can go ahead and ask your question live in glorious Technicolor.
But let Dr. Slobogian just finish that thought that she started, or that little topic, because I'm psyched.
Yeah. So I guess first question of the Q&A, I'll answer what Celia was kind of asking about, which is, well, you said, what about those silver noses that people would wear in lieu of plastic and reconstructive surgery, and kind of what's the longer history of this type of reconstructive or plastic surgery as we know it today? And so historically, plastic surgery has been happened, for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think the oldest going back is in India, maybe the 2nd century AD. That was the first time that a nose was reconstructed. But more famously, it's I want to say 16th century Italian surgeon who started to use bits of flesh from the person's own body to reconstruct their nose. And so that's what's happening in a lot of these images that I showed. It's actually strips of skin from, you saw the one gentleman who had it from his forehead going down, or from areas like the inside of the arm or the inside of the thigh, because you have to get areas that aren't hair bearing, because otherwise you would have hair growing down your nose. But what you were just saying about silver noses is really interesting, because in the First World War, which is when Harold Gillies, the surgeon I was talking to, really came to prominence and became the father of modern plastic surgery, which is super debated. And I'm not sure I'll always buy that, but they were still using prosthetics. So there's this incredible, there are a couple incredible artists, sculptors working during the First World War and after, one of them who was named Anna Coleman Ladd, and she was making these tin prosthetics, and there's a place called the Tin Noses Factory. So, kind of jokingly called the Tin Noses Factory. But there's, so those are the two alternatives, right? You either go through months and months of difficult surgeries for a face that, as I showed in the color photographs, still isn't perfectly smooth and, scarless, or you opt for something that's more obviously false.
Wow.
But yeah, I think the history of plastic surgery in Britain, a lot of people start with Harold Gillies in the First World War and use Tonks's images, those pastel drawings that I showed, as the imagery to describe it. I argue that it goes back a lot further than that, and that Gillies isn't the end all be all, but that's where a lot of it typically or traditionally starts.
Wow. Oh, fantastic.
Well, like I said, don't get me started on the history of plastic surgery.
All right. Well, I'm going to read a question now from Trevor Hardy, all the way in New Zealand, in Tomorrowland. All right. Trevor Hardy asks, thank you for a fabulous presentation. Could you possibly give an outline of the photographer's career post-war, considering his latter publication was of a distinctly different environment? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I am still trying to fully figure out the reasons for, his shifts in career. He did, after the war, continue to do some medical imagery. I think the last medical publication that he did was published in 1948 or 1949, but a lot of those images had been taken during the war. So I was speaking to another photography historian, Val Williams, who's written about Percy Hennell, and we kind of have this idea that can't be totally substantiated, but we have this idea that he left the medical field in part because of the intense trauma that he may have experienced in that time. Of course, this is all speculation, but in addition to doing the photographs on the home front that I showed you, he was also posted out to Naples for a 4-month period where, the things that he describes, and I haven't seen any of these images because actually a lot of them have disintegrated or are lost or are locked away in archives that you can't get to. But, he saw really, really, really terrible things. He had to document a typhus outbreak. He had to show, the horrible conditions in Naples. And so I have this idea that he was like, right, I'm done with medical imagery. I'm done with doing this after the war. So he actually, he did some photography work for the Neo-Romantics, like I showed you with Jeffrey Grigson and John Piper. And then he really just transitioned into wine and spirit photography, which is a much more
Sounds like it would
calming,
be, yeah,
less
therapeutic.
yeah, a much nicer thing to do. And so, he worked on books on champagne, the history of wines in Spain. There are quite a few books that you can still find in some context online. Yeah, so there you go, Clint. So that was pretty much his post-war career, was photographing alcohol, and he also did some work on his own family's history. So I mentioned that he came from a family of goldsmiths, and so he started to do some research into his family's illustrious silver and gold salt cellars that they made.
Mhm.
But that's pretty much it. So I wish I could further substantiate the reason for him leaving medical photography, but he did quite clearly take a turn from that field.
Wow. We have another question in the chat, this time from Ian Archer. Hello, Ian. Good to see you again. He is the man who is wearing the red hockey jersey. All right. Did other countries try to use color photography post World War II to highlight their achievements and medical advances?
That is a really good question. And I have to admit kind of my ignorance on this one, because I do really focus on the British context. And I've started to look more at the American context up until 1950. I'm sure that the answer is yes. Oh, sorry, I just got distracted by the next question. I'm sure that the answer is yes, but what I actually initially work on, my initial scholarly interest is on surgical and medical illustration, so not photography. And that is quite often the better option instead of color photography, because of some of the issues that I brought up in this presentation, and because of things like shadows and photographers can't simplify medical images. They have to include all of the shine, all of the visceral innards, all of the blood, whereas medical illustrators are often chosen instead of photographers because they can use their judgment to simplify things out, to make things easier for others to understand. So it's not really an answer to your question, but I hope that it kind of helps you understand like some of the other images that were being used in this period, and why it's not necessarily always going to be color photography, even though you might think that that is the best way to document medical progress and medical advances. So I think Hennel is a pretty special example of this, and Britain in general.
Fantastic. Well, we have a follow-up question from Trevor Hardy. This is an amazing coincidence. I am studying the life and work of Lee Miller, who moved from fashion to surrealism to combat photography, but after the war, left photography as a result of her PTSD and took to, I don't know how to pronounce hot cuisine,
Oh,
oot,
oop.
oot, right?
Haute cuisine. Haute cuisine.
Haute cuisine, right? She also sadly became an alcoholic.
Trevor, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I'm a huge Lee Miller fan. And I've been thinking about this parallel in her life and Percy Hennel's life, and total shameless self-promotion. But I've got a podcast, and we just did an episode on Lee Miller. Actually on her, she did a photograph of severed breasts from a radical mastectomy surgery, which obviously feeds into my interest in the history of surgery as it relates to visual culture and photography. And so, I find that really, because that was before her war work. So it's just a different way of approaching her ideas around, the body and trauma and all of that. But yeah, there definitely are some parallels, I think, between Lee Miller leaving her war work and Percy Hennell leaving his medical war work. I love Lee Miller so much.
Wow, fantastic. We have another question from Maya Sutnik. Have the original negatives used for the reproduction press purposes been analyzed and compared to the editorialized images?
Not that I know of.
Oh, sorry, there's a second part. To
Oh.
the extent, sorry, let me read the question again.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Okay. Have the original negatives used for the reproduction press purposes been analyzed and compared to the editorialized images to the extent that photographs are not necessarily collaborator, but lose rights over their images as commissioned work?
So as far as I know, the only copies of these photographs now are in the archives of the British Association of Plastic Surgeons, essentially. And as far as I know, the negatives have not been analyzed in any substantial way. I mean, Hennell's photographs haven't really been written about that much in general.
Mm-hmm.
But you are right that, it pretty much always is the case in surgical imagery, and that's with photographers and with illustrators or draftsmen and women, that they did not have rights to their images, that they went straight to the surgeon, which is a really complicated relationship if you think about the fact that the government was paying for, well, actually in Hennell's case, the metal box company was paying for his war work to happen.
Oh,
Because he was seconded by the government. But yeah, quite often the rights to the photographs, well, they weren't even really thought of as the rights. They just went straight to the surgeon, and the surgeon then could do with them what they wished.
Wow.
I hope that's an answer to your question.
Oh,
Yeah.
Maya, we can hear you.
I put the information about my podcast. It's called Drawing Blood. In the
very cool. Very cool.
Very cool. All right. Let's are there other questions? All right, I got a question. Sorry, Clint. Okay. Have you come across anything that just like grossed you out?
Blew your mind.
Sorry, what'd you say, Clint?
Blew your mind.
Well, it's interesting that you ask that. So I think the disgust reaction is really interesting. And I write a lot about my own experience in these archives, right? So about the emotional reaction that you unavoidably have as a historian when you're just going through photograph after photograph of blown away faces, broken jaws, etc. And I found that actually it often wasn't discussed. I argue that it's like a really physical empathy that I have to some of the worst images. I think because it so often is the face, and that is where we assign personality and individuality, that it feels so personal. Seeing someone who's, somehow survived a gunshot wound that's taken off that whole side of their face, or someone who, that gentleman with the striped pajamas that I showed, he's one of my favorite patients. I see so many of, I think there are 14 photographs of him and maybe 45 drawings. So I know his case really, really well. And you build, I think by the nature of, how much I work with these images, it really does become like a relationship that I build with them. And I think that is much more a result of photographs rather than drawings. And I found that to be the case with Hennell's photographs and color in particular, much more so than with any of the drawings. But I will say that also some of the images that I said were missing from Hennell's trip to Naples, his really grueling assignment to Naples. I'm actually really glad that those are missing, because I have descriptions of them, and it's I don't want to see them or, write about them in any, I don't particularly think that that'll be helpful to anyone. But yeah, it is a difficult subject matter to work with for sure. And the images that I showed you are definitely the more sanitized, tame images. Yeah, for sure.
Wow.
I just wanted to address one tiny little remark you made about the whole notion of Technicolor and movie making Technicolor in America being a different notion than in England. Actually, I don't know. I haven't seen much research on it, but anecdotally, in the photo retail business, I think there's a few photographers still with us here. Film, Kodachrome, transparency, film manufactured from for the North American market was different than that was manufactured for Europe, for instance. We knew that chromes here in North America were punchier in the reds, and in Europe they tended to be considerably, relatively speaking, less punchy for the reds and more, I don't know, the greens, maybe the blues a little tiny bit. So absolutely, manufactured for the North American market.
That's super interesting. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
That's really helpful.
I can't rely on any research I've ever read, but it's very much anecdotal information. And many years ago, I worked in a shop and we had access to short dated and tight dated film, expiry date wise, from a wholesaler who was able to purchase truckloads of film. Kodak stuff, great material, made in London or in The Hague or in, I believe, Cairo and other parts of the world. So he was playing, the dollars and cents market, purchasing it wholesale somewhere where it's gone bankrupt or something like that. And we did note a difference if it were processed exactly the same way. It was easy enough to adjust at the lab level.
But that's really interesting because that hasn't been mentioned in the in the color work by art historians that I've been looking at. So I'll have to look more into that.
It's got somebody, I mean,
it's got to be out. No, I'm sure it is. And I'm sure I've missed it.
But I think the touchstone of all films is of course Kodachrome, which in theory was manufactured to one standard and one standard only. Which is not to say that it was manufactured to one and only one color balance.
No,
so
that's
perhaps
that's
there's something to be delved into there. I don't even know where one would start.
No, definitely. Definitely. A lot of the material that I got for my discussion of Technicolor and its nationalist, or the way that British people thought about it, it's from Sarah Street, who's a film historian, and from Linda Need, who has this amazing book about post-war visual culture called Tiger in the Smoke, which is basically about how in post-war Britain everyone loved gray. Not really, but like that's kind of that's a really simplified, and probably she would take issue with that simplification of her thesis, but
nonetheless
it's really interesting.
Right. Some interesting thoughts there.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
Personal experience, that's all I can say.
Oh, Sully, are you muted? Are you speaking?
Of course, I am muted.
There you go.
As usual, of course.
It has to happen at least once in every.
Absolutely. Actually, that was planned. Trevor, as a follow-up question. Was there a similar movement within the German government, considering their fixation on propaganda and heavy use of photography? Of course, he means the Nazi government during World War II.
Yeah. And unfortunately, again, I need to expand beyond Britain. So I don't know the answer to that. I would imagine that there would be, but I also imagine that, but I haven't seen anything. But I also imagine that because I'm looking at British sources and I'm largely in the archive of the British Association of Plastic Surgeons, and they are so keen to, you know, keep up this narrative that they're the only ones doing this type of photography and that they're the only ones doing this type of surgery. My sources are, you know, in their very nature, going to exclude me knowing about those types of things. So you know what I mean? To find out about this, I'm gonna have to go out into other archives and look at other collections. So unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that.
It's a touchy subject. Every now and then something blips up above the surface. I read a rather fascinating book on the history development of how the Germans dealt with very specifically cancer, and kind of more lung cancer, starting in the late 20s, all through the 30s, and how they went from a nation where, as did everybody in the late 20s, smoked, to where very few people smoked. Right? Touchy in that, you know, it was ultimately designed to, you know, improve the master race, so on and so forth.
Of course,
so
yeah.
that material is, you know,
It is, and you know, a lot of the medical images that I would be looking at if I was looking at German collections of the 1940s or 1930s or 1950s would be non-consensual experiments.
Correct. Experimentation on twins, so on and so forth.
Exactly. And so that, I mean, I already have a lot of ethical considerations to take into account when I'm finding my material, writing about it, presenting it, publishing it, everything. So I am not sure that I particularly want to add another
layer
element to that.
Yeah, it's another.
And that's why, I mean, speaking of ethical considerations, that's why, you know, half of the patients in my presentation had the black bar over their eyes, half of them didn't. And that's because you have to be really careful about, okay, if images have been published before, then it's okay to put them in your presentation, because you assume that someone before got consent. They haven't been published before, then the archives, you know, ethics rules state that you have to put a black bar over the eyes. But then, of course, you have the question of, well, does that actually do anything? And if the question is whether they would be recognized by themselves or by their family members, obviously those people would still be recognized by, you know, loved ones. So it's a really tricky thing that I have to deal with. And I tend to just go, okay, what are the rules? I'm going to stick to those. You know, and also my own ethical compass. But it's changing all the time. But it is tricky. And yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to go into the experimentation realm of photographs and drawings.
Just have a question. Couldn't really write it all out, but given that during that period of time, color photography wasn't that commonplace. You're in Britain, there were rationing restrictions. Was his ability to shoot color photography in large part due to the funding of the government by propaganda? Because it must have been proportionally much more expensive to do this. Also, you know, in terms of the publications that they are printing in color, most publications, you know, color was a luxury. in a
Mhm.
magazine or something of that nature. So I'm just curious whether proportionally, did he have a large collection of black and white images, or was he exclusively into color? And how did he support all that? Who paid for all that given the period of time?
That's a really, really good question. Percy Handel was pretty much only color photography. I have not seen a single black and white image by him.
Really?
That's
Wow.
the smaller question. And in
Huh.
terms of funding, actually, so you know how I said that he was a manager of the color photographic department of the metal box company, that company that did metal boxes. They actually paid for his material and his salary during the war. So he was actually seconded by them to the Medical Research Council. So the government wasn't paying his salary. However, during the Second World War, that is when the government realized the kind of efficacy and importance of surgical photography. And that's when, and then, the National Health Service was founded in 1948. So the late 40s is when you start to get governmental funding of photographs like Hennel's. And that's when you start to get photographic departments within hospitals instead of people like Hennel traveling all around them. And then in terms of color imagery, I think now I'm hitting all the points of your question, I think. And then in terms of color as, a luxury, these companies like AdPrint that I mentioned, doing these books like British Women Go to War, that was not the only type of book like that. Like, this was a very common type of publication. There's also Stephen Spender's book called Citizens at War, I think, and that is illustrated with color images by another British photographer named John Hind, who was working at the same time as Hennel. So there were a couple of them working in this field, and in terms of the funding of that, I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, but part of it is from the government to kind of project this really, as I said, this particularly British color, this like vibrant documentation of Britishness and British life and the British countryside. So you had British Women Go to War, Stephen Spender's book, and then you had things like Britain in Pictures, which was another series of books that did have color illustrations and color photographs. So it is a really interesting contrast between, austerity Britain and these bright images. And actually Linda Need, in that book that I just mentioned, The Tiger and the Smoke, she does talk about this, especially in the post-war couple of years. I hope that answered at least bits of your queries. Good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it remains in the back of my head how you, what you mentioned about British taste for Technicolor. That was in the 1940s and into the 1950s. Are there any traces of that contemporary today?
Well, I mean, I think you definitely still have British conceptualizations of Americans as garish and too brash. Those wordings definitely still ring true as an American living in Britain. I'm often the loudest person in the room. But in terms of film and photography, I'm not as aware of contemporary, contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, in the podcast,
Yeah.
we just recorded an episode. It's not out yet, but on the film Midsommar, the horror film by Ari Aster.
Yeah.
And it's all filmed in Sweden. We talked about how the kind of bright whiteness of that color, the bleaching out of everything, lends it a certain national flavor.
Mhm.
And so I do think that that is still very much a thing. But in terms of British attitudes towards American color, I'm not so sure.
Mm. Oh, thank you.
Yes, not an answer to your question, really.
That's I just wondered because I mean, when I was in
Yeah,
England, people express their opinions rather openly,
yeah, yeah.
right? And so I was wondering if some of these attitudes survive, right? Where there's still a rejection of loud color.
Yeah.
I don't know. When I think of British images, I don't think of lively colors, even
Right.
though they are. I
No, I
mean,
mean, I think I agree with you. I think I
right?
agree with you.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that 1951 source that I quoted
Mm.
has been so helpful. I've used that in everything. It's been very helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, at this point, I would like to ask to invite more of you guys who are still remaining, who are still going strong. If you have any final questions for Christine.
What are you working on? What can we expect from you in the future? Because we'll keep in touch,
Yeah.
see what you're up to. Because you're such a brutal speaker today. You know what I'm saying? What's going on? What's going on?
So the fellowship that I have right now that Celio mentioned at the beginning at the University of Manchester is a new project, like really fledgling research that is going to continue working on photography more so than on illustration. And I want to write a history of medical anonymity in photography in Britain and America. So thinking about, well, I came to this idea through having to put black bars over Percy Hennell's images.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you have to use that? Where did that convention come from? Why are the eyes given so much importance? So I'm currently collating all my examples for that. And Celio was at this conference last year, but there's at De Montfort University here in the UK at Leicester, their annual summer conference. Their conference this year the theme is photography history without photographs, which is a great
Yeah.
theme.
Have you submitted?
So I'm going to submit an article about the prints that were made off of photographs in medical images, and
very cool.
why those were considered anonymous while the photographs weren't. Those photographs don't exist. So what do we do with the prints? Not photographic prints, like engravings or
Right.
lithographs.
Right.
Yeah.
Translations into other media.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. It's very much a fledgling process. And then I'm still working on, plastic surgery illustration, not photographs. So that's my first love, I guess.
Very cool.
And I'll keep working on that and get some stuff published. Thank you for asking, allowing me to plug.
Well, no, because I mean, I'm assuming you're consistent and working on interesting stuff yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So to speak. Gotta ask,
Because we are going to be asking you to come back, right? You realize this.
Great. I'll be happy to do it. Do it while I'm in the States. Because
Yeah, right. We can have some. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
You will have to be caffeinated or as caffeinated.
Yeah.
Right. Excellent.
Well.
We have one final question, one final comment and question from Trevor. Trevor wishes to extend his sincerest thanks for a brilliant presentation, and I'm going to second that. Indeed.
Thank you very much.
Oh my goodness, really, really solid. And Ian has a question about color again. Given that color photography was around prior to the period you have researched, do you have documentation on the first use of color photography in medical documentation?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I wish I had an answer. All that keeps popping into my head, because I keep looking, I've been, surrounding myself with all of these prints, is when color lithography starts to be used. And that's like the late 19th century. But in terms of color photographs, I mean, once again, they were expensive. And I do think that Hennel is kind of a really early
Pioneer.
example of this in medical imagery. Even if he wasn't inventing his own cameras, as the plastic surgeons said he was. I wish, I'm so sorry. I wish I had a very specific answer for you, because I want to know that as well. But it's definitely something that I'm hoping
some homework, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. As if I don't have enough homework already.
At least you don't have to shovel snow.
Yes, that is true. But we've got the ridiculous storms coming through, so I've been hearing the wind outside. But I'd take wind and sun over snow anytime.
Yeah, that's the smart choice.
Agreed.
All right. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Christine Slobogin for an amazing presentation, an in-depth study into color photography and reconstructive surgeries in Britain during World War II. Fantastic work, great images, but really amazing food for thought. Thank you so much. We hope to see you again in the not too distant future. And I would like to thank everyone who has come to tonight's program. It is great to see many of you here again, and also meeting so many new faces, as it were. We have launched a YouTube channel where we are making some of our video recordings available once the guest lecturers agree to publishing them. So subscribe and you will be notified whenever new recordings are ready to be enjoyed.
And thank you so much again for inviting me, and thank you for all of your questions. They were really helpful, even if I couldn't answer them.
Oh, you did a fantastic job.
Oh, here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So don't worry. All right. So thank you, everyone, so much. Merci. Arigato. As they say in English, cheers.
Yes. Yes.
Cheers. Yeah. All right. And we'll stop recording now.